58 years old, and you're still wearing a watch you bought at a strip mall. Do you understand how that reflects on me, on us? My daughter said that to me across a table covered in white linen, in front of 40 people who'd come to celebrate her engagement, and she said it with a smile on her face, like she was delivering a toast instead of a verdict. She raised her champagne glass a half-inch higher, like she wanted the room to notice her, not me. Her fiancé, a slick man named Preston Cole who ran something called a wealth optimization consultancy, chuckled into his drink and didn't bother looking away. My son-in-law-to-be already believed he was looking down at me. And my wife, my own wife, Diane, the woman who'd shared 32 years of my life, reached over and patted his arm and said, "Be nice, honey," in a tone that made it clear the correction was for tone, not content. Nobody at that table disagreed with what my daughter had said. They just wished she'd said it more quietly. I sat there in my gray sport coat, the same one I'd had tailored 11 years ago and never needed to replace because I take care of my things, and I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because while my daughter Reagan stood there mocking a $40 watch, she had no idea that the restaurant we were sitting in, the one with valet parking and a 2-month wait list, was mine. She had no idea that the wealth optimization consultancy her fiancé bragged about to anyone who'd listen was funded, every dollar of it, by a line of credit I controlled. She believed her success, her fiancé's success, her whole shimmering life, had nothing to do with the quiet old man in the cheap watch. And within 72 hours, I intended to prove to her exactly how wrong she was. My name is Harold Whitfield. I'm 61 years old, and for 36 years I built commercial real estate in Charlotte, North Carolina. The unglamorous kind, parking structures, distribution centers, strip malls, nobody photographs for magazines. I want to walk you through what happened next, neighbor to neighbor, because I've turned it over in my mind so many times since, and I still don't know if I did right by my own daughter. Maybe by the end of this, you'll help me figure that out. I didn't raise a cruel woman. I need to say that clearly before anything else, because it would be easy for you to hear what happened at that dinner and decide Reagan was simply born hard, born ungrateful. That's not the whole truth, and I won't tell you a story that isn't the whole truth. My daughter learned to measure people in dollar signs from somewhere, and that somewhere wasn't me. It was her mother, and it was the world her mother built for her, after everything changed between us 4 years ago. Not a divorce, we never divorced, but something quieter, and in some ways worse. Diane stopped seeing me as a partner, and started seeing me as a checkbook with opinions she'd learned to tune out. The dinner that night was held at a restaurant called Amber and Vine, which Preston had chosen personally, making a point of telling everyone he'd had to call in a favor to get the private room on short notice. He had no idea the favor had been called in on his behalf by my property manager, who ran the entire building on my instruction. I wore the same charcoal suit I always wear to occasions like this, plain, well-made, unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what quality actually costs. Preston wore something with a sheen to it, cut a little too tight in the shoulders, the kind of suit that photographs well and falls apart within 2 years. He'd clearly copied the pose from somewhere, one arm slung over the back of his chair, swirling his scotch like he was auditioning for a role. He was telling the table, loudly enough that the neighboring table could hear, that his firm had just onboarded 3 new high-net-worth clients, that his numbers this quarter would put him in a different category entirely. I said nothing, because I knew something none of them knew. I knew the name of the small business lending fund that had extended Preston's firm, its operating credit 8 months earlier, right when he was drowning and hemorrhaging clients. I knew that fund existed because I had personally seeded it. I brought a forkful of salmon to my mouth and tasted absolutely nothing, because every ounce of my attention was fixed on the show being performed 6 feet from me. If you've ever sat at a table while the people who are supposed to love you weighed you and quietly filed you under not enough, then you already understand exactly how that salmon tasted going down. Reagan sat there glowing under the restaurant's warm lighting, and some nights I could still see the little girl who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck on the drive home from job sites. But that night, I mostly saw a stranger who'd learned to flinch whenever I opened my mouth, as if whatever I might say would embarrass her before I'd even said it. She turned to Diane at one point and said Preston was exactly the kind of man who understood what real ambition looked like. She wasn't talking to her mother. She was talking past me, the way you talk past a piece of furniture that happens to be sitting at the table. Then Preston, having let Reagan have her moment, leaned toward me with that low, practiced, patronizing voice men like him rehearse in mirrors. He told me I'd clearly worked hard my whole life, that he respected that, genuinely, but that I'd never learned to think bigger, never learned to leverage what I had. He said men of my generation built things brick by brick because we didn't understand the concept of scale. He said it kindly, like a doctor delivering bad news, and Reagan nodded along like she was witnessing a man finally say out loud what she'd believed about me for years. Small. That was the word underneath everything he said that night. Small thinking. Small ambitions. A small life. Last year it had been old-fashioned. The year before, careful. The specific insult kept rotating. The contempt underneath it never changed shape. The stories kept coming, the beach house Preston was eyeing in Wilmington, the trip to Positano they'd already booked for the honeymoon, the new watch on Reagan's wrist that cost more than I'd spent on my truck. Each detail landed like a small stone thrown just to hear the sound it made against my silence. And then, near the end of the meal, Preston flagged the waiter and made a show of putting the entire check on his card, glancing at me while he said it. One more quiet performance of who the provider was now. And that's when the thread finally gave out. Reagan stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor loud enough that a few heads at nearby tables turned. And in that beautiful, expensive room, in front of 40 guests, she gestured from Preston to me and delivered it, clean and cold. That's the difference. You spent your whole career hauling steel and concrete around, and Preston builds real wealth. You wore that same suit to my college graduation. Do you understand how humiliating that is? Preston nodded along, sipping his scotch like he was watching a play he'd already read the ending of. Diane looked down at her plate and said nothing, and her silence, I realized, was the actual betrayal, worse than anything Reagan had said out loud. And here's the thing I keep coming back to, the detail that makes this so much more than a simple insult. I looked into my daughter's eyes for one long second, and I saw, underneath all that polish, the 6-year-old who used to run to the door every evening when my truck pulled into the driveway. A flicker of something that might have been shame trying to surface. But it drowned fast, pulled under by everything Preston and Diane had spent years teaching her to value instead. And the anger I expected never came. What arrived instead was a kind of cold, engineering-grade clarity, the same feeling I get when I'm staring at blueprints and finally see exactly where the load-bearing wall needs to go. I set my napkin down beside a dessert I hadn't touched. I stood. My chair didn't make a sound. I looked at Diane, then at Preston, and finally at Reagan, and without saying one more word, I turned and walked out of that private room, and the door closed behind me on their little celebration. I didn't need to explain anything. What came next would explain itself. I didn't call a car. I walked. The wide, glittering avenue gave way slowly to my own street, quieter, older, unimpressed with itself, and my house came into view under 2 oak trees I'd planted the year Reagan was born. A modest brick colonial I'd built myself over 18 months, back when I still had enough hair to sweat through. It wasn't much to look at from the road. It was built to last, same as me. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and old paper, the smell of 30 years of the same life lived carefully. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour a drink, because a clear head was the only thing I needed that night, colder than anything Preston could manage in that overpriced suit. I went into my den, a small room off the back of the house where every object had a job. Blueprints of parking structures and distribution warehouses hung framed on the walls, buildings that still stood, still worked, still held weight decades after I'd signed off on them. On the corner of my desk sat a photograph in a plain wood frame, Reagan at 6 years old, wearing my hard hat, which swallowed her whole head, grinning at me from the cab of a excavator like I'd handed her the moon. Where did I lose that girl? The question didn't hit sharp. It landed slow and heavy, the way exhaustion does after you've been carrying something for years without setting it down. I had spent too long being quiet. I had believed that love without conditions meant love without limits, and I had been wrong, because giving everything away isn't love. Sometimes it's just cowardice, wearing a kind father's face. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop and typed a password only one other living person knew. A simple folder structure appeared on the screen. Property holdings, a private lending fund, a commercial lease portfolio, a consulting retainer agreement. Each folder name meant nothing to anyone who didn't understand what they really were. Invisible threads, I'd spent years weaving quietly underneath the life my daughter believed she'd built for herself. It was like standing inside a building you designed, watching people admire the marble floors while having no idea what kind of steel was buried in the foundation below them. Without it, none of it stands. Tonight, I was going to find out whether the steel could be removed without anyone noticing until it was far too late. I opened a secure message to my attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Corinne Ashby, who'd handled every complicated thing in my professional life for the past 15 years, someone I trusted with things I hadn't even told Diane. The message was short, no pleasantries, a single subject line, begin foundation, reset, and one instruction. Start unwinding every asset connected to Reagan and Preston, beginning with the lease on Preston's office. I hit send. The little whoosh of the email leaving felt enormous in that quiet room. The first domino was balanced right at the edge. I felt no satisfaction in it. Just a strange, settled calm, the calm of a man who's checked his math 3 times and knows the numbers hold. The next morning, I sat across from Corinne in her office on the 11th floor of a glass building downtown, and she didn't shake my hand. She set a mug of black coffee in front of me, made exactly the way I drink it, because she'd read my email at 6 a.m. and known immediately what kind of morning this was going to be. She pulled her chair around to sit beside me instead of behind her desk. She told me that when she'd seen those 2 words, foundation reset, her stomach had dropped because she'd hoped for years we'd never actually need this plan, that Reagan would find her own way there without it. So had I. But the moment had arrived, and there was no version of tonight where we didn't use it. She asked me to walk her through the human part first, the part no legal document could ever capture, what exactly had happened. And I told her my daughter had stood up in a room full of strangers and called my whole life small, and that Diane had watched it happen and said nothing, and that the worst part, the part that actually kept me up, was that Reagan believed every bit of it. She believed the beach house, the honeymoon, the watch, all of it belonged to a version of the world where I simply didn't matter anymore. Now, here's where the story turns, and I need you to stay with me, because this is where you understand exactly how badly they'd all misjudged what I was capable of. 3 years earlier, Corinne reminded me, Preston had come to me, not to Reagan, to me directly, quietly, humiliated to have to ask because his consultancy was 6 weeks from folding. He'd overextended himself chasing an image, and he needed an emergency line of credit no bank would touch. And I could have handed him a check myself and let him know exactly whose money had saved him. But I understood something about a man like Preston. If I handed it to him directly, he'd spend the rest of his life resenting me for it, and Reagan along with him. So I did something smarter. I told Preston I didn't have that kind of liquid cash sitting around, that my money was tied up in slow, boring investments. He walked away disappointed, already looking elsewhere, calling me privately not someone who understood real business. But I didn't walk away. I went to Corinne, and together we set up a private lending fund, registered in Delaware, run through a management company with a respected retired banker as its public face. As far as Preston ever knew, he'd secured funding from a discreet boutique lender who saw potential in his firm. He signed the paperwork, thrilled, and never once asked who actually sat behind that lender. The terms were mine to write. The fund held the first position lien on his firm's receivables and equipment. Preston believed he owned his consultancy outright. In reality, his entire operation could be frozen with one signature, mine, buried 3 layers deep in paperwork he'd never bothered reading. Then there was his office, the glass-walled suite downtown with the skyline view that Preston photographed constantly for his social media, captioned things like, "Built this from nothing." His personal credit had been too thin to lease commercial space at that address on his own, so the lease had gone through a property management entity, which Preston believed was simply the building's ownership group being generous to a promising young firm. In reality, I owned the building. I'd bought it 9 years earlier. Another unglamorous, undervalued property in a neighborhood nobody cared about yet. When Preston applied for that suite, my property manager reached out with a special introductory rate, citing his firm's growth potential, and Preston signed without reading the clause tucked into page 11, the one that tied his occupancy directly to continued good standing with his primary lender. My lender. And finally, the largest piece, Reagan and Preston's new house. The one in the good school district with the wraparound porch that Diane had been photographing for months, like it was already a museum exhibit. Reagan had asked me for help with the down payment 8 months earlier, and I'd told her no, that it was reckless to buy above their means. and I watched something in her face close off toward me completely in that conversation. What I never mentioned was that the seller's agent worked for a brokerage I had a controlling stake in, and I'd quietly instructed them to hold the property, to keep pushing the closing date, until Preston's firm secured its next round of outside funding that only existed because of me. The mortgage itself carried a private second lien, arranged through yet another entity carrying my name nowhere visible on the paperwork. So there it was, laid bare on my desk that morning. His firm, his office, their house. Every pillar either of them stood on to feel superior to a man in a $40 watch was something I had quietly built, funded, and still owned the keys to. Reagan and Preston weren't self-made. They were two people who had never once been told the truth about the ground underneath them. He has nothing, I said to Corinne, and neither does she, not really. Everything they think belongs to them is actually mine. And here's where I want you to slow down with me, because this next part is what separates a story about revenge from a story about something harder to name. Corinne asked what my first move should be, whether I wanted to hit them with everything at once. The office, the credit line, the mortgage, all before Friday, a full collapse in one motion. And I shook my head. Because that's not correction. That's just cruelty with better paperwork. I explained it to her the only way a man who spent his life around structures actually could. When you need to bring a building down safely, you don't set explosives at the base and walk away. That's careless. It sends debris into places it was never supposed to reach, and it hurts people standing nearby who had nothing to do with any of it. A professional does it in sequence. You strip the fixtures first, the things that catch the light but hold no weight. Then you take the windows, the view a person has of their own life. Then, floor by floor, until what's left is the bare foundation, undecorated and honest. I didn't want to destroy my daughter. I wanted to strip away the illusion she'd been living inside until she had no choice but to stand on something real. Looking back, I'm not sure most people could have gone that slow. The patience to dismantle something piece by piece, when every nerve in your body wants to end it in a single motion, that discipline came from 36 years of building things that had to bear weight for decades without failing. You learn patience the hard way, or your buildings come down on someone's head. So we made a schedule. Monday, freeze the fund backing Preston's firm and notify him his credit line was under review. Give him 1 day to feel the floor shift. Tuesday, instruct the property management company to begin formal review of his office lease, citing the same funding irregularity. Let him feel it in a place his clients could see. Wednesday, when Reagan and Preston were both rattled and confused, have the brokerage quietly pause the closing on their new house, pending underwriting concerns on the second lien. Take the pillars away one at a time, slow enough that each loss had weight of its own before the next one landed. This wasn't born out of rage. It was a curriculum, and curriculums take time to teach anything worth learning. Over that weekend, while I repainted the porch railing and let the whole thing settle in my chest like sediment, my daughter spent her days telling everyone how relieved she was to finally have cut her father off emotionally, how healthy it felt to stop needing my approval. I heard about it later, secondhand, through a cousin who still checked in on me. Preston told anyone who'd listened that the old man had thrown one final tantrum and that it was, in his words, sad, honestly. He saw my silence as surrender. He saw 36 years of quiet patience as proof he'd finally beaten me at something. And Reagan, my daughter, spent Saturday afternoon browsing wedding venues with her mother, already spending money that existed only because I hadn't yet turned off the tap. Then Monday came. I spent the morning at the hardware store, unhurried, but I knew that across town the gears had already started turning. Preston walked into his glass-walled office, expecting his usual morning, and found an email waiting from the lending funds management company, citing an internal audit and freezing all disbursements effective immediately, pending review. He called the number on the letterhead, and a calm woman explained that the funds board had voted the prior evening and that the decision was final, and there was no appeal process available to him. Preston laughed at first. He told her there had to be some mistake, that his firm had a strong relationship with the fund. She said, politely, that she couldn't discuss the board's reasoning further, and the call ended. He sat there staring at his phone, and for the first time in years, felt something close to fear settle into his chest, though he still had no idea whose hand was actually on the switch. If Monday was a tremor, Tuesday was the earthquake. Preston arrived at his office to find a certified letter waiting from the property management company, informing him that his lease was under formal review due to material changes in the tenant's financial standing, and that a decision would be issued within 72 hours. He tried calling the leasing office directly and got a receptionist who transferred him twice and then put him on hold for 11 minutes before the line simply disconnected. He canceled his afternoon meetings, told his assistant he had a migraine, and sat alone in his glass office, watching the skyline he'd bragged about for years, feeling, for the first time, like a man standing on a floor that might not be there tomorrow. By Wednesday, Reagan came home from work to find Diane already at the kitchen table, pale, holding her phone. The real estate agent had just called, gently, professionally, explaining that underwriting had flagged some irregularities on the second lien tied to their new house, and that the closing, scheduled for that Friday, would need to be postponed indefinitely. Reagan's first reaction was disbelief, then anger at the bank, then, slowly, a colder kind of dread creeping in as she thought back to Preston's frozen credit line and the lease letter he'd finally admitted to her the night before. 3 separate collapses, 3 separate institutions, all in the same week, all touching the same 2 people. It wasn't bad luck. It was too precise to be bad luck. And there was only one person quiet enough, patient enough, and connected enough across all 3 of those pieces to have made it happen. The man in the $40 watch. Her hands shook as she dialed a number she hadn't called first in over a year. I answered on the second ring, my voice even and unhurried, and that steadiness seemed to break something loose in her, because she started talking before I'd even said hello, asking if I had anything to do with any of it, her voice already cracking on the word anything. And on my end, there was a long silence, the same silence from the restaurant, the same silence I'd carried all weekend. But this time it wasn't defeat. It was the silence of a man who finally had the floor. When I spoke, I told her it was time we sat down and talked, in person, tonight. Now slow down with me here, because what happened next is the center of this whole story, and it deserves every second of the time it takes to tell it properly. Reagan arrived at my house less than 40 minutes later, and I watched her get out of her own car this time, not Preston's, and walk up the same brick path she'd walked 1,000 times as a girl. I didn't meet her at the door. I waited in the den, let the doorbell ring twice, then told her to come in through the intercom. She walked into that small room, the same room she used to do her homework in as a teenager, and I watched her actually see it for the first time in years, not a dusty hobby room belonging to an old man who'd stopped mattering, but something closer to a command center. I sat behind my desk and didn't stand when she came in. I didn't raise my voice. I just folded my hands and let the silence sit there until she broke it first. And she did, her voice cracking somewhere between anger and panic. What did you do? Why is everything falling apart at once? Preston's credit is frozen. Our house is gone. His office. She stopped herself. Like saying it all out loud made it more real than she could stand. I gestured to the chair across from my desk and told her to sit, that the shouting part of tonight was over, and that now it was time to actually listen to something for once. There was something in my voice she hadn't heard directed at her before, and she sat down slowly, the anger on her face starting to curdle into something more like fear. I turned my laptop screen to face her, and one by one, I walked her through it. I opened the lending fund's formation documents and showed her my name buried in the ownership structure, 3 layers down. I told her, quietly, that Preston didn't actually own his firm free and clear, that the fund holding a lien on nearly everything it owned was mine and had been from day one. She shook her head and whispered that it wasn't possible, that Preston had built that firm from nothing. I didn't argue with her. I just opened the next file. I showed her the property management agreement on Preston's office building, my name on the deed, the review clause tied to his lending relationship. He was never renting from strangers who admired his ambition, I told her. He was renting from me, on my terms, the entire time. Then I opened the last folder, the one connected to the house with the wraparound porch. I showed her the second lien, the brokerage ownership structure. My involvement in every stage of a purchase she'd believed was entirely her own doing. You weren't buying your first home, I said, gently, which somehow made it land harder than if I'd shouted it. You were living inside something I built and paid for, the same as you always have, and I simply let you believe otherwise, because I thought it was kinder than the alternative. The color drained out of her face as she stared at the screen, at proof she couldn't argue with, black and white, and dated and signed. Every pillar she'd used to measure herself against me had been something I quietly constructed underneath her the entire time. And the anger in her expression finally gave way to something much harder to watch, something closer to shame. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one more piece, I told her, the keystone of the whole thing. You told me, in front of 40 people, that Preston understood real ambition, that he'd built real wealth. Let's actually talk about that. I opened a final document, the original loan agreement from 3 years earlier, the one Preston had signed the week his firm nearly folded, back when he'd come to me directly, quietly, before he ever proposed to my daughter. This is the day your fiancé's business would have ended, if I hadn't stepped in, I told her. He never told you that part, did he? He built his entire story about himself around the idea that he saved his own company. He didn't. I did. And I never told either of you, because I wanted to see what kind of man he'd become once he believed he'd done it alone. Reagan's eyes went wide, and she actually recoiled in the chair, and I let the silence sit there while she connected the pieces herself. The man she'd praised for understanding real wealth, the man she'd let mock my $40 watch, had been standing on money I'd quietly loaned him at the exact moment his own life was collapsing. The version of him she loved, the confident, self-made version, had never actually existed. He was leaning against a structure I'd built and never taken credit for. She made a small, broken sound, and I watched the entire architecture of what she believed about her own life, about Preston, about her own achievements, come down quietly in that small room. She wasn't a player who'd simply lost a hand. She'd never known which game she was even in. And here's the part I understood in that moment that I don't think anyone else in this story ever truly grasped. Money given in silence isn't generosity. It's a kind of control, dressed up as love, and I'd been doing it for years without admitting that to myself. I had confused providing for people with actually raising them, and in doing that, I'd built a daughter who could perform confidence without ever once testing whether it was real. I told her I hadn't destroyed anything that was ever truly hers. I'd simply stopped propping up things that were always mine. And then, for the first time since she was a teenager, I told her she finally had the chance to build something from actual ground level, to keep her job, to rent an apartment she could genuinely afford on her own income, to learn what it felt like to earn a single dollar without a hidden hand underneath it. The money, I told her, still existed, and her name was still attached to parts of it, but she wouldn't see another cent of help until she'd proven, to herself more than to me, that she could stand without it. Then I stood up, my knees aching the way they do now, and walked out of the den, leaving my daughter alone with everything she'd just learned. I didn't look back at her sitting there. There wasn't anything left to add. The weeks that followed were the quietest I'd known in years. No dramatic phone calls, no manufactured emergencies designed to pull me back in, just an unfamiliar, settled kind of peace. I sat on my back porch one evening with a glass of sweet tea, the old rocking chair creaking under me in its usual slow rhythm, and I thought, clearly, for the first time in longer than I could remember, that I had never actually been small. I had simply been quiet, and quiet had never meant weak, no matter how many people in that restaurant had needed it to. Then my phone rang. It was Diane. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some old habit made me answer and just listen instead of speaking first. Her voice came through fast and frightened. Preston's firm was on the verge of collapse without the credit line. Reagan had put the wedding on hold, unable to explain to anyone why, ashamed to say the money simply wasn't there anymore. And it was my fault, Diane said, her voice rising, because I'd been jealous my whole life of anyone who dared to actually succeed, because I couldn't stand watching our daughter build something bigger than anything I'd ever managed. There was no apology in any of it. No mention of that dinner, of what our daughter had said to me in front of 40 people, of Diane's own silence while it happened. Just a desperate, familiar demand that I fix what I had, apparently broken, because I still had the money, and somehow, in her mind, I still owed everyone around that table something. I let her talk until she ran out of breath, listening to the crickets start up in the yard, watching a firefly blink somewhere near the fence line. And when I finally spoke, there was no anger left in my voice at all, and no satisfaction either. Just a simple, settled fact I'd been circling for 36 years and had finally arrived at. Diane, I said, that's not my problem to solve anymore. And I ended the call, set the phone face down on the little table beside my chair, and let the rocking chair find its rhythm again in the dark. I had gotten my dignity back. I had gotten my evenings back. And sitting there in the quiet, in a house I'd built with my own 2 hands 30 years ago, wearing a watch that still kept perfect time, I finally felt, for the first time in longer than I could measure, like a man who'd actually built something that lasted. So let me ask you something before you go, neighbor, because I genuinely want to know where you land on all this. Do you think I did right by my own daughter? Tell me one if you believe I did exactly what needed doing, that this was hard love and she needed every bit of it to wake up. Tell me too if you think I went too far, that pulling everything away at once was its own kind of cruelty dressed up as a lesson. Or tell me three, if you think the real fault sits with Diane and Preston, and that my daughter was simply raised inside a world they built for her, and never really had a fair chance to know any better. And tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because it still amazes me how far a quiet man's story can travel. Has anyone in your life ever underestimated you, only to find out later exactly how wrong they were? I'd like to hear about it. I read every single thing you write to me. If this one meant something to you, stay a while longer, because we tell stories like this all the time. Stories about the quiet ones, the underestimated ones, and the exact moment the truth finally catches up. I'd be glad to have you back for the next one. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. And thank you, truly, for caring enough to listen.